Today at the National Press Club, Minister for Government Services and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Bill Shorten. Labor's committed to improving the NDIS, but delays, stretched services and rorting are posing major problems. Bill Shorten with today's National Press Club address.
And welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address. My name is Andrew Tillett. I'm the political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and the Vice President of the club here. Our guest today is Bill Shorten, the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Government Services. Mr Shorten was elected to Parliament in 2007, and as a junior frontbencher in the Rudd government, he helped lay the groundwork for the creation of the NDIS. When he became Minister following last year's election victory for the Labor Party, he inherited a scheme that had expanded to become one of the fastest growing areas of government expenditure. Today, Mr Shorten will outline the steps he plans to take to ensure its financial footing for the hundreds of thousands of Australians relying on its services is put in place. You can follow the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAust or hashtag MPC. Please everyone welcome Bill Shorten to the stage.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I appreciate the opportunity of the National Press Club to give an address on the future of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's actually 14 years to the month when I stood here as the Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities to talk about how every Australian with a disability deserved a right to an ordinary life. Now, the club's changed its menu a few times since then. We're all a bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser. I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the Canberra region, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present today. I also want to acknowledge the 1 in 5 Australians living with a disability and their families today. I've had no greater privilege in my 15 years in politics than to listen to, learn from and work with so many great Australians from the mighty disability movement. They're great Australians, humble people who've campaigned for decades. We've got Chairman Kurt Fernley here, Doogie Hurd, Rhonda Galbally, Kevin Cox, Graham Innes, Marianne Diamond, Leah Van Poppel, Meredith Allen, there's Craig Wallace, Kirsten Dean, Bruce Bonady and many more. There's great people I've met but we've lost. Leslie Hall, Sue Salthouse and Stella Young. I have stood on the shoulder of these fierce warriors and the millions of Australians that they represent. If you are an Australian living with a disability, a family member of a person with disability, or a carer, I want to say something to you right now. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is here to stay. It is not going away. But, and this is important, we do need to get it back on track. It's not a financial imperative, it's core to improving outcomes and improving lives. Correcting course will not be easy. It'll take time and require the sort of collective effort that you Australians with disability showed during the campaign to establish the NDIS in the very first place. But, and this is important too, I will work with and for you every step along the way. I want to brief you and the nation on the work that must be done to secure the future of the NDIS. I want to explain why we created the NDIS, explain how the NDIS has lost its way, and explain why we need to reboot the scheme and disability services and supports. So not just the why, but the how. You could call this a sort of State of the Union address on the NDIS. Why we created the NDIS, this year when we talk about why we created it, marks a decade since the inception. The NDIS was and remains a bold initiative. Big, complex, life-changing economic and social policy. but it's driven by a basic human question that has fueled my own political journey, the itch that I have under my skin that I've always had to scratch. How in the lucky country can we tolerate any Australian being treated as a second-class citizen? I had the privilege to be appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities by Prime Minister Rudd at the end of 2007. Before then, I thought across 2 decades of working as a trade unionist, I thought that I knew disadvantage and discrimination. I thought I knew powerlessness and poverty. I thought I knew my country, but I didn't. Great advocates like Leslie and Rhonda and Stella showed me an invisible Australia, an Australia that shut out its fellow citizens from education, employment, housing, you name it. An Australia where an Indigenous person with a disability faced a double disadvantage. It was an Australia that was unfair, propped up by a support system that was inefficient and unsustainable. I met too many people with disabilities who suffered isolation and disadvantage because others could not see beyond their impairment. I heard too many ageing parents speak of their midnight anxiety of who would love their precious adult child with a disability when they no longer could. Siblings too, who shared these same fears. I saw people who had accidents go from an ordinary life to subclass citizen in a split second, not because of their impairment, but because of the system that was failing them. I saw families and carers who willingly put their life on hold to care and love for their person with a disability, but were tired, physically, financially, emotionally exhausted. In 2007, and this is a fact some have conveniently forgotten, Australian state and federal governments in general, and disability services in particular, were on a course for a socio-economic catastrophe. The country is paying more and more for worse and worse outcomes for people with disability. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, go back and read the 2009 Shutout report on the experiences of people with disability, or the 2011 Productivity Commission report into disability care. Labor created the NDIS. We thought it would save people with disability and those without from the catastrophe that we could see coming. And here's the thing, we were right. The NDIS has changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Australians with disability and their families. People like Avi, a 6-year-old from Darwin who loves playing wheelchair basketball and being with her friends, but happens to have a rare genetic neuromuscular disorder. The support she's received through the NDIS make Avi stronger and more independent. Not only that, that assistance has enabled her mum, Bethan, a former ballet dancer, to open her own baby ballet school. 11-year-old Ace, he'll tell anyone who's listening, he's a great swimmer, he's a pro at riding a horse. But Ace was born non-verbal and needs assistance with everyday activities. He now has a communication device and a speech therapist. He can speak for himself with the aid of technology. And the NDIS is a lifeline for people like Greg and Kevin. Kevin is a 47-year-old First Nations man. His passions are arts, crafts and woodwork. He also has an intellectual disability and requires 24-hour care. When he lost his mum, Sally, Kevin's dad, Greg, took over sole responsibility for his care. Thanks to the NDIS, Kevin's learning to garden and cook and further develop his social skills. NDIS participants like Kevin and Avi and Ace were shut out of the mainstream back in 2007. Theirs is but literally some of hundreds of thousands of lives, and the NDIS has also saved a disability system from collapse. The truth is that the NDIS is the difference between a life and a living death for many vulnerable Australians. And as a nation, every state and territory and every community has directly benefited economically and socially from the NDIS. Australians overwhelmingly support our scheme. Australians witness the difference it makes to families, communities and nation. Remember, 1 in 5 Australians reports as having a disability. None of us are immune. We're all touched by it. Every one of you today knows someone with a disability. Think of them and then tell me that the NDIS isn't a great idea. Australians know the NDIS is as fundamental to our social democracy as Medicare and universal superannuation, fair pay and the pension. It's built upon the great good Australian idea of the fair go. The NDIS is something that we all in Australia can be proud of. But a decade of mismanagement means it's in trouble. Fraud and inefficiencies have led to a narrative where cost overrides the reality of return on investment. As NDIS reported last year, for every dollar invested in the NDIS, it's delivering a $2.25 return to the economy. If only all government interventions or private businesses could boast this outcome. Now, one of the measures of a great reform, I put to you, is that it outlives the government. The NDIS outlived the Rudd-Gillard governments and the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison governments. Testament to the strength of reform, testament to the strength of community support. But there is a difference, isn't there, between surviving and thriving. During the last 9 years, the NDIS has been undermined by constant attack from a revolving door of disgraced coalition ministers. The coalition record of malign neglect is appalling. They muzzled the National Disability Insurance Agency. They wouldn't even let the NDIA choose its own IT system or hire enough people to answer the phones and run the scheme. The board was stacked with political confederates. They tried to bulldoze through reform, which they called independent assessments. But that was just Orwellian doublespeak for Robodebt 2.0. They let down people with disability by leaving the NDIS wide open to fraud. It's one of my greatest regrets is that the NDIS has been at the mercy of administrative vandals for 90% of its existence. The fact that it survived, though, is credit to the dedication of people with disabilities, their families, their advocates, their allies, the service providers, unions, and the never to be underestimated decency of the Australian people. But the NDIS is not what it should be. It is not delivering the outcomes Australians with disabilities need and the Australian public expects. For the NDIS to reach its potential, it needs a reboot. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to deliver on the how, not just the why. Let me explain what I mean. In the days and weeks and months since we were elected, this government has worked to deliver on our promises. For me, that's working every day to get the NDIS back on track. I know every day counts in the lives of people with disabilities and their families. Last October, I appointed an expert panel to conduct an independent review of the NDIS. That panel, co-chaired by Bruce Bonahady and Lisa Paul, is consulting widely. It'll report back to me by October. It's reporting on the design, the operation, sustainability of the scheme, and how we build a more responsive, supportive and sustainable market and workforce. But that doesn't mean that we're sitting on our hands waiting till the final report. I believe the first and best way to safeguard the integrity of the NDIS is to put people with lived experience in leadership roles. And that's why, even though he's a greatly humble man, I managed to convince disability advocate Kurt Fernley to become chair of the NDIA board. He still hasn't forgiven me. We are genuinely lucky to have a leader of Kurt's calibre. We're proud that also people with disability are now half the directorship of the NDIA board. Now, under the coalition, the efforts of hard-working staff were smothered by what I call a clay layer of management that stubbornly resisted progress. Since becoming minister, the value of the grassroots NDIS staff has stood out to me. These good people deserve the kudos for the work they do, as well as for sustaining their vocation for working in disability under the previous administration. There's been a culture shift, breathing new life into the National Disability Insurance Agency. I want to acknowledge the contribution of our new CEO, Rebecca Forkiam, and the refreshed executive of the NDIA. But we also said that we'd crack down on fraud, and we're doing that. Last October, we created a Fraud Fusion Task Force. It's now got 38 investigations underway, involving more than $300 million in payments. Unethical actors and criminal syndicates have taken advantage of the poor administration. Tip-offs are increasing now. The volume's almost double what it was this time last year. 1,300 in January, 1,600 in February, 1,700 in March. I can't go into detail about the investigations, but it's personally infuriating that some Australians think that they should be allowed to steal from people with disability. Every dollar of NDIS funding must go to the people for whom the scheme was designed, full stop. Now, there's another area that we couldn't wait until October to act upon, which was the warehousing of NDIS participants in the hospitals of Australia. In 2021, a Victorian government analysis found that on average, it took 160 days to discharge NDIS participants after they were medically ready to leave hospital. Imagine that. You're ready to go home, but you've got to spend almost a half a year waiting, while there are other people languishing on hospital waiting lists. This situation makes no sense. It's not just an immense waste of resources, but it's a return to a Keynesian reality that the NDIS was designed to end, an insidious violation of human rights. Our government's put people and supports in place to slash the bed block in hospital discharges. We've already reduced delays from 160 days to 29 days. It's saving, according to the AMA, up to $550 million to hospital costs. We're tackling another inherited problem too, the 400% increase in appeals to the AAT. These appeals force participants to undergo months and years of exhausting litigation. I'm pleased to tell you that 70% of the legacy cases parked in the courts at the time of the election are now resolved. So in summary, we've been busy, but as important as the changes are, they're nowhere near enough. To deliver the outcomes that will change the lives of more Australians with disability and secure the sustainability of the scheme, we need to deliver systemic reform. And let me be clear, I mean systemic reform of the whole disability support ecosystem, the NDIS, mainstream and community services. When I talk about rebooting disability services, that's what I'm talking about. Systemic reform. Let me quickly detail the fundamental systemic flaw identified to me by participants. The system is too rigid. It throws up Kafkaesque barriers to access. It lacks empathy. It gouges on prices. It's way too complex, and it's traumatising for people to deal with. People with disability have often felt caught between some predatory providers and a historically impersonal government agency. We've got to improve the participant experience. If we improve participant experience, if we make people's lives easier rather than harder to deal with the NDIS, we will reduce waste, inefficiency and inflationary costs. Now, to the journalists in the room, this isn't a budget dump. I'm not about to steal the Treasurer's thunder. But what I am doing, there they go, what I am doing is outlining the 6 policy directions that we'll work on to deliver better outcome for people with disability. In the process, help secure the ongoing future of the scheme. This approach, of course, has been discussed with the board, the NDI leadership and the review leadership. Our first systemic reform is to increase the NDI workforce and its specialisation. To improve the participant experience, we must focus on the people they deal with in the agency and the people who support them in the community. That means lifting staff caps, returning some call centre functions in-house, getting the culture right so we can reduce the staff churn. Points emphasised by the Joint Standing Committee on the NDIS in its interim report, and it's great that the chairwoman, Libby Coker, is here today. The bottom line is that to improve outcomes, we need to nurture a better relationship between the staff of the scheme and participants. We need to have the capability and specialisation to proactively intervene to fill service gaps in areas like Indigenous communities, regional and remote and rural Australia. We've got to update our system so that people with disability only have to tell us their story once. Investing in better resources and better systems will also avoid cases where people in the same family with the same or similar disabilities receive completely different funding plans. Ultimately, greater investment in NDIS capability equates to participants being treated with understanding and humanity. Our second systemic reform is to move to long-term planning. Short-term planning just isn't working. It's stressful, debilitating, frustrating, nonsensical. That every 12 months or 6 months, participants and their families have to prove that they're still disabled. Amputees must still prove they're missing a limb. But the people who are blind, we've got to prove they still can't see. The people who have Down syndrome, but they still have Down syndrome. Instead of causing grief and wasting resources, let's think long term. Why not have multi-year plans, more flexible and sustainable, freeing up time to produce better plans that deliver better outcomes to people with disability, ridding us of the perverse incentive that the only thing that matters in the NDIS is the plan, getting it, keeping it and renewing it. And this will deliver more predictability for all involved. Longer term plans can't be set and forget though, I understand. They need to be able to adapt to participants' changes. The needs of a person with Huntington's, for example, does change over time. But the principle of long term is better than short term stands. My third systemic reform is the need to address spiralling costs. Reasonable and necessary supports lie at the heart of the NDIS. It is a bounded concept. Supports must be reasonable and necessary. I also just said that I want to maximise the benefit of every NDIS dollar we spend. I want to be clear. I'm talking about maximising the benefits for the participants, no one else. There are some providers who do overcharge for goods and services. There is, unfortunately, a cultural assumption in Australia that where there's government money, you can charge more. Because an NDIS package is taxpayer funded, it is not fair game for the doubling and tripling of prices. It shouldn't be treated as some sort of wedding tax. And remember, if one provider is overcharging for their service, it means a participant cannot afford another service they might need. I expect the independent panel to provide recommendations on ways to maximise participant outcomes for every dollar spent. Participants are valued clients, not human ATMs. If we can trial such things as blended payments to achieve incentives to look at outcomes rather than being dependent on the volume of supports. We must also return to the underlying goal of any intervention. The underlying goal of any intervention is to reduce the need for support over time and increase participants' independence in their daily living. The parent of any child on the NDIS will tell you that they hope that their child can exit the scheme as soon as possible. I'm pleased to announce today the NDI will fund a pilot program in partnership with the Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia that will examine whether preemptive intervention for children showing early behavioural signs of autism may reduce the level of support required later in life. Some 700 families in Western Australia will be invited to be part of the pilot, and if that shows that intervening earlier can assist children to have improved outcomes as they develop, I think it's very exciting for future generations and for early intervention mainstream services outside the NDIS, so the NDIS is not the only lifeboat in the ocean. Our fourth systemic reform is to review supported independent living, or SIL. Supported independent living is designed to allow people with higher needs to live in their home, but with significant amount of help, 24/7 if necessary. Currently, the program is delivering poor outcomes for too many participants. In some cases, SIL splits up families or couples and drives people into institutional settings that can, in some cases, be inappropriate and absolutely not in the best interests of the participant in terms of safety, quality and outcomes. The NDIS review is already looking at ways to get better home and living decisions for participants. Integral to this is the housing supply, the rental market accessibility, co-tenancy models, the role of community housing, other innovative housing and accommodation models designed by people with disability and their families. Our fifth systemic reform must be to target the misuse of NDIS funds, to eliminate unethical practices, to go beyond tackling criminal syndicates, with a renewed focus on evidence and data. We can get rid of shoddy therapies that offer little or no value to participants or desperate parents. What I class as unethical practices includes pressuring participants to ask for services or support ratios they don't need, spending participants' money contrary to their plan, asking for or accepting additional fees for a service, and offering rewards for taking particular services not on a participant's plan. But let me stress at this point, there are so many great service providers, from the whole range of the big, long-standing not-for-profits to new family-run small businesses. But we must say to the untrustworthy providers who make participants feel dehumanised, who feel treated as cash cows, you're not welcome. You taint the reputations of quality service providers. Your old business models will change. We'll have more NDIS staff in place with the skills to ensure that providers deliver outcomes and don't overcharge. My sixth and final reform is fundamental. The NDIS needs to be surrounded by increased community and mainstream supports. When I say increased, it is more a case of mainstream services actually delivering on inclusion and universal service provision as they've always been meant to do. I hear from many individuals and families that a form of unintentional division seems to have crept in, where if you have a disability, you take the NDIS line and you don't take the mainstream line. And once you're on NDIS, everything becomes an NDIS issue. People's lives are not dictated according to the division of responsibilities, a national scheme or a state scheme. These are their lives. It's the job of government to fit in with the cycle of people's lives, not the other way around. We want to look at how we can do this better together. Existing mainstream services and facilities, like health and education, transport, they must be more accessible and supportive. We are still having some of the same arguments that we've been having when I first became the Parliamentary Secretary. We need to foster inclusion and not segregation. We need to see investment in community-based programs, sports, rec, education, ensuring these programs are better integrated in the support mix for NDIS participants. It's about doing these things in addition to properly funding the NDIS. Because the NDIS in isolation cannot deliver on the vision of independence, because it was never conceived or promised to support every Australian with any disability. There's that great recurring sentiment across our community is that it takes a village to ensure Australians with disability get to live a fulfilling life that many take for granted. I acknowledge the work of my colleague, the Minister for Social Service, Amanda Rishworth, for driving the work on Australia's disability strategy to help this. And I'm rapt to see the newest Minister for Disability in the nation, Kate Washington, here from New South Wales, and welcome. And I look forward to working with her and the other states and territories for the states to step up. As I've said in many other places, the level of state government cannot have it both ways. They can't retreat from supporting people outside the scheme and, on the other hand, make a diminishing contribution to the NDIS. All levels of government need to honour their commitment to their citizens with disability, to provide them with high-quality, inclusive healthcare, education, justice, housing, transport. It's a joint responsibility. So finally, I want to say to the people with disability across Australia, I understand your sense of urgency, your urgency to make the NDIS work better for participants. Our government will continue to work with the disability community to design and implement improvements that need to be made. Public trust and confidence in the scheme is crucial, and it will be dependent upon our reforms serving the best interests of the participants. The best interests of the participants is our litmus test. We don't want the patchwork reform of our predecessors, which was a bit like the proverbial badly renovated house. Rooms tacked on without rhyme or reason, hallways that lead nowhere, and doors that don't open. It is unacceptable that vulnerable people find this mess almost impossible to navigate and feel sometimes totally abandoned by the scheme. So there is, within the disability community of Australia and the broader Australian people, a desire for substantive, systemic reform. But for any reform to work, we need the engagement of the disability movement. I need your experiences of the disability world, your input, your support. Having first met you in 2007, having seen what you're capable of in the campaign for the NDIS and to defend the NDIS, I've got no doubt that we'll succeed. Australians support the NDIS because it is life-changing for people with a disability and their families. It's simply transformative. Our NDIS represents what's best about Australia. That we look after each other and, most importantly, look after those who need extra support. The NDIS sees the whole person, not just the impairment. It seeks to empower all Australians to participate in the life of our country on their terms. We are a lucky country, and we should not exclude anyone from that opportunity because of a disability. This extends beyond the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do for our country, for those with disability and those without disability, for our economy, for the nation we want to see in the mirror. Without the NDIS, the cost to Australians will be far greater than today. It's 10 years now from the very first initial trials in the Barwon and the Hunter regions. Australia's NDIS is embedded as a fundamental government promise on a level with Medicare. Medicare is the idea that the health of any one of us matters to all of us. At the centre of the NDIS is the understanding that disability could affect any one of us or our family. And talking of Australian values, there's no greater embodiment than the disability movement, which is really a shorthand way of me expressing my privilege to stand alongside the advocates of the disability movement and serve the millions of Australians they speak for. If you are an Australian with a disability, let me say this to you. It is core business of Labor to reform and restore the NDIS, to undo the drift of the last decade, ensuring that the NDIS is secure and sustainable. It is the source of world-class, life-changing support, delivering for the next generation of Australians who will have need of it. I can promise every Australian who cares about the future of the NDIS that the size of the challenge in front of us is more than matched by the strength of the Albanese government's determination. And if I can conclude, if you'll let me, on a very personal note. After the bitter disappointment of the 2019 election, I came to the understanding the universe does not grant reruns. But with every precious minute in the job as NDIS Minister, I actually do feel like I have a remarkable second chance to return to where it started, to serve where my passion beats. I've said before, working with disability advocates, people with disability experts, with Julia Gillard and Jenny Mack, and literally thousands of Aussies living with disability, it has been a journey of discovery and of privilege. I know there is nothing I will ever do that is more important than securing the future of the NDIS. I am here because of you, and I am working for you, and together I know that we can create the NDIS which you deserve. Thank you.
Bill, just back to the lectern. Thanks, if that's okay. Thank you very much for your speech, Bill Shorten, and thank you to our Auslan interpreters there as well. We've got a very long list of media questioners today, so I'm going to go straight to it, and please keep it all to one question or else. Oh. Our first question is Jade Gailberger.
Jade Gailberger from the Herald Sun. Thank you for your speech. I just wanted to touch on some remarks you made about invisible Australia and second-class citizens. At the end of last year, Australia failed to meet a coalition commitment to have no people under the age of 65 entering residential aged care facilities and no people under the age of 45 living in these facilities. When will your government set new targets? What year will they be achieved, and how will you actually achieve them?
Okay, well, that's a good one question. Perhaps let's go to the last point first. Yes, the targets of the Coalition promise haven't been met. There's been a lot of good effort to try and achieve them, but we're diving down between ourselves, Department of Social Services, great to have the Secretary here, Ray Griggs, and the NDIS, and to see how we can better approach people principally between 45 and 65 who haven't moved out in the same way that I think younger people have, and we've got to see what's causing that blockage. The issue of getting people into appropriate accommodation, though, is part of a bigger challenge. So it's not just aged care. I've talked about how we've done it with hospitals. What we did with hospitals is we put in an extra from 29 liaison people working at the NDIS to 54. And what they do is, though, there's a lot of great allied health clinicians and care teams, social workers working at hospitals with people who are in hospital. And what we've done is given those extra resources, extra people, to wrangle accommodation, and we've been able to give the planners and the people dealing with the people stuck in hospital greater autonomy to make decisions. What we discovered is that a lot of decision making tended to be in a series of single decisions. So if you were getting a train between 5 railway stations, the way that processes were happening is you'd have the first question, you get on the first stop, then you'd get off, even though you wanted to travel 5 stations, you'd have to get off at the next station and wait till you'd made that first decision. And so it was a series of consecutive decisions. What we try to do now is give more autonomy to the wranglers and the hospital teams to make decisions concurrently. This doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's a very revolutionary concept. So I'm keen to see what we can do with aged care in that same approach we've used in hospitals. There is a challenge though around medium-term accommodation. See, you don't want to keep someone in a facility while they wait for their forever accommodation when you could help get them into better accommodation, but it has to be medium-term. It doesn't become their long-term accommodation. So we're looking within the agency at looking at how all of our housing options are getting the most qualitative intervention. One of the solutions I've outlined today generally is investing in the capability of the agency. Now, we've done that at the top and the board, and I've given kudos to a lot of the grassroots frontline NDIS staff. They're great. It shouldn't sound as simple as it is, but I actually think it is. This agency has been unloved. They put a staff cap in 2017 when the scheme had 4,000 staff and 170,000 people on the scheme. There's still about 4,000 staff at the last election, but there's 565,000 people on the scheme. So if we have better specialisation, better investment and training of the people in the agency, I think the capability will help start unblocking a lot of the blockages, including aged care. As in terms of future targets, we'll have to see what the budget says and what my colleagues in aged care are saying.
Thank you. Next question, Phil Curry.
G'day, Mr. Shorten. Phil Curry from the AFL. 2 things in your speech I think are related. You talked about the systemic reform required is not just the NDIS but mainstream and community services as well. And then in your conclusion you said the states have to step up. They've clearly been hiving their own services onto the NDIS since you signed this deal. I think the original deal was a 50-50 funding split between the Commonwealth and the states for NDIS, and the Commonwealth would agree to pick up any blowout, and I think you're now on the hook for around 70% if I'm correct, for the funding. Is it now time, I think that funding agreement's coming up for revision, are you going to push at a Commonwealth level to rework that agreement, that funding agreement?
I think there's a challenge generally about inclusion. It's not just the states. Some hospitals used to supply cosmetic eyes to little children who were born without an eye. It's a very rare condition. That's now been told by the hospital. The hospital's now said that's an NDIS cost. I spoke to a family of a woman who works 3 days a week. She's a medical scientist doing exactly what you'd ask for someone, but she needs a tube in her throat to feed. The hospital said that's no longer their issue, that's an NDIS issue. So there has been cost shifting. What I've tried to do is demonstrate the goodwill of the NDIS by sorting out the hospital bed block, which is saving states hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's got to be fair go all round. So I found the state disability ministers to be an excellent crew to work with. They're very engaged. It'll be no doubt a subject of discussion. at central agencies, Prime Minister, First Ministers, Treasurer, Treasurers. But you can't have it both ways. You can't sort of see a retreat from the provision of community mental health services, for example, and then say, oh, that's all NDIS, when in fact the NDIS isn't looking after everyone with a mental illness. So there's got to be an identification about where the gaps are, an encouragement of states to step up and do more of the disability funding. I think education's a clear area where that's an ongoing challenge. There's also a challenge in terms of the funding formula, and that'll be negotiated through. But I think that a thing like we announced with the Telethon Institute, if we can help with our best evidence and our data, encourage the states to help put a universal screening out for kids who are 12 months old, rather than waiting till developmental delays are identified at 3, what we do then is we create a range of supports. Not every child with developmental delay at 12 needs to be in the NDIS. It might be that they've got undiagnosed hearing challenges. It could be simpler conditions, frankly, which we've already mastered how we can help that child have the same learning experience. It could be just as simple as putting parents in touch with other parents. The NDIS was never meant to contract out everything else. It was meant to work with everything else, and these are the challenges. There's a lot of goodwill to try it, but we'll do our bit. You know, we'll clamp down on the overcharging, we'll make the agency better. We're going to certainly work in the range of those areas I've tackled.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next question from Nicole Hegarty.
Nicole Hegarty from ABC News. My question also relates to states and them picking up their share of funding as well. In this conversation about how to make the NDIS viable long term, much of the focus often turns to rorts and how to claw back some of that. What role, in terms of the share of making the scheme continually viable, do states play?
There's a little bit at the start of your question, which I just want to rephrase or at least disagree with the assumption. The scheme's viable. The scheme's viable. It's here to stay. I think the challenge for us is not just a state issue. The challenge is how do we make sure that every dollar that the scheme has is getting to the people where it's meant to go? That's the sweet spot. And the way to do that is if we're constantly working on giving the participant the best experience, that actually then starts to deal with the waste. It's not the best experience for the participant to have a junk therapy. It's not the best experience for a participant that when you've got a child at a school, who pays for the sport chair? Is it the special school or is it the NDIS? So I think the filter which helps give us clarity is what's the best experience for the participant, and that way we build and maintain the trust in the scheme. We'll eliminate the waste and the overcharging and the opportunistic and unethical behaviour if we always ask ourselves the question, what's the best evidence? How do we deliver what's reasonable and necessary based upon the evidence to participants? I know I'm sounding a bit optimistic there in the light of the sort of ballooning balance sheet, but I think if you go through the reforms that we've outlined and the approaches plus what we'll get in October, I think there's clarity, and that's what it needs, focus and clarity. Thanks.
Next question, Tom Connell.
Thanks, Minister. Tom Connell from Sky News. You've given an exhortation for suppliers in particular to do the right thing today. We have seen over many years at least some do things like double and triple charge for anything from beds to gardening to meals, more exotic stories, if you like, of psychics with crystal hearing, carers saying they need to go on a cruise with someone else as part of a respite. And a lot of these providers presumably have no compunction with doing this. Is it time to go harder on compliance? My understanding there are, I think, 2 blacklisted providers. Do you need to be a much tougher cop on the beat? Because a lot of these providers, I'm not saying most of them do it, but the ones that are doing it don't really care about what you have to say today about doing the right thing.
Just to segue, and I remember during the Beaconsfield mine disaster, some people would say, are they dead? And others in the mining industry would say, oh, they're having a great time. This is the 2-trap miners. The truth's always between, isn't it? And I just want to say about the NDIS, the truth's between there's nothing wrong at all and it's all ruined. The truth's a lot more real. The truth is that most service providers are brilliant. The truth is that most disability carers have a vocation. The truth is that people with disability aren't looking for truffles and, caviar. The truth is that most parents would like to see their kids, if they've got a learning delay, end up in mainstream education if that's possible. So when I talk about how we crack down on overcharging, it's a problem. Some people in the disability world say, I don't talk about the problem, it means people won't like the scheme. I think we underestimate people with disability on the scheme. I've done meetings with, down in Brighton with Zoe Daniel, and I've done meetings with Tanya Plibasek in the Waterloo Public Housing. Very different socioeconomic areas, but both full of participants. When I say, let's try and stop, bath chairs in showers being, priced a lot more as soon as the seller knows you're on the NDIS, everyone agrees. What I want to say today to people who look at the expenses in the scheme, of course the silly stuff shouldn't be allowed, and we're going to tackle that by investing in the agency. If you've got consistent decision-making in the agency, with people who are familiar with the disabilities, if you've got longer-term plans, if we have better ICT scrutinising whether or not an account's being unduly drawn down or it seems to be running ahead of the budget, we're going to sort some of this out. But I will just also say that the sweet spot for reform, how do we thread the needle between people who are concerned about, tens of billions of dollars every year and what have you, and participants who, even this discussion today and the very balanced reporting saying I was going to talk about a reboot, we've had families ring up and say, does this mean I'm going to lose my package? So there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of muscle memory of the last 10 years. So yes, we are going to crack down on the fraud and we're going to invest in more systems. If you've got a business model where you are sort of mining someone's supported independent living package for your own interests and not the participant, sell your business now, because it's not going to be worth much by the time we've finished with you. We're going to put participants first. But in putting that sort of negative cop on the beat frame, which has to be done, I say to everyone, the scheme is good, it's world leading, no one else in the world does something like it, any of us could need it, and there's a lot more good news than bad news in the scheme. We just think we can get even more good news in the scheme and deal with the issue of inappropriate costs. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, Natasia Chrysanthemos.
Hi, thank you. Minister, in your comments about spiralling costs, you said the NDIS needed to return to providing reasonable and necessary supports, and you've also referred to shoddy therapies. Could you give us some examples of what you think are some unreasonable and unnecessary supports that are going to help with that spiralling cost issue and how you plan on dealing with those?
One of the ways we reasonable and necessary should be based on what's evidentially sound. Listen, I take my life in my own hand. I don't want to get hate mail, but I am not convinced that NDIS money, I'm not saying it ever has, should be used for tarot reading. That's the sort of one which seems to float up on Twitter. I haven't identified quite where it's happened yet. So whether or not it's but that's out. I think the better and sounder approach, though, other than just using a sort of basic common sense test of what public and people on the scheme would sustain. See, the thing is, there's almost been a bit of a binary division in the way that we talk about the NDIS, that somehow the public want one thing and the participant wants something else. This is the magical light bulb moment. The participants and the public want the same things. There's not a competition between the two. They're not in two sets of trenches against each other. So I think that what we need to do is give our planners and the agency better swim lanes about what works and what doesn't. You can imagine that if you've got a child who is not developing in the way which you thought they might initially, this is very stressful times. You can then imagine that if there's a shortage of psychologists and a shortage of professional help, someone says, well, the NDIS at least will get you something. Then you can imagine, though, that you have to prepare reports, it's pretty stressful. Then you have got a 12-month plan, and if you feel that you haven't used up all your money by month 10, because it's short-term plans, you have this perverse incentive, I better spend it, because if I don't spend it, they may take it off me. This is where I think having evidence and experienced and skilled planners can help make sure that people aren't getting hoodwinked. But that's partly the government's fault too. And again, I must say to all of the allied health service professionals and others who might be watching this and saying, oh no, most people do a great job. So it's not about everyone, but I do think that if we have better evidence-based processes supported by the agency, referable like the PBS, not everything, just because we have subsidised drugs doesn't mean that you get every drug subsidised. And I think that there's an opportunity there for us to use third-party evidence, not for individuals, but just for the general science of what we do.
Thank you. Our next question is Jess Malcolm.
Thanks for your speech. Jess Malcolm from the Australian newspaper. Just wanted to clarify whether you're open to changing who is eligible for the NDIS as a way to rein in spending.
No, there are some groups who seek to be included where the scheme we have no plans to. That's people who acquire their disability over 65. And I understand that's very difficult. But the Parliament, and to be fair, all sides of Parliament, said that this scheme was for people under 65, aged care is for over. The fact that aged care has atrophied, I think, adds tension to it. So we're not looking to add in a vast slab of people. One of the challenges has been that this is a personal view, and I'll wait to see what the review says. But if we solely rely on diagnosis, then you can get yourselves caught in all sorts of categories of inclusion or exclusion. I don't want to do that. I think it is looking at the whole person. So no, we're not looking at slicing slabs of people off. No. We're not looking at changing a whole lot of diagnoses and putting them in. But I think there are some people not on the scheme missing out. And that's going to be a challenge. And I think there's people on the scheme who we could support better. And I don't think it's inevitable that every child with a developmental delay at the age of 3 should end up on the NDIS. But we've got to make sure there's other supports out there. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, Dan Jarvis-Vardy.
Dan Jarvis-Vardy from the West Australian. Thanks for your speech, Mr. Shorten. Let's assume that this reboot works. The 6 points that you've outlined are delivered. The scheme becomes better for participants. You're able to weed out dodgy providers and crack down on fraud to the extent that's possible in a scheme such as this. What then if, because of the uncapped nature of the scheme, the cost continues to increase and let's say it becomes $80 billion per year but in 2031, 2032? Is that acceptable? If we have a good scheme but it costs that much, is that acceptable?
I understand your question, but I'm not going to play. I'm not going to put up a fictitious, say there is a magic number which works. What makes the scheme sustainable is if participants are getting outcomes. What makes the scheme sustainable is if public trust in the scheme is high. What makes the scheme sustainable is if we deflate some of the inflationary pressure in the ways which I've said. The scheme will grow each year. That's inevitable, and I say that again clearly for people beyond this room. I don't see the scheme as shrinking, and that's not what we're trying to do. But if we focus on the outcome for the participant and the maintenance and rebuilding of public trust, then I think you will end up seeing the right priorities being targeted. There shouldn't be a wedding tax. There shouldn't be people providing junk therapies. People should have outcomes focused. But I tell you what, if you're a person who's born with a disability which is significant and permanent, if you acquire it in the blink of an eye on a country road, or if you get it through the onset of early ageing with a range of genetic conditions, you should be in the scheme, and that's what I want to see. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, Maeve Bannister.
Maeve Bannister from the Australian Associated Press. Thanks, Minister, for your speech. I wanted to take you to another area of your interest, which has been the Robodebt Royal Commission.
Yep.
The Royal Commission heard accounts of a pretty toxic departmental culture where people felt like they either couldn't raise their concerns or if they did, they weren't listened to. You're now one of the ministers in charge of that department. What steps have you taken to change that culture? And should senior public servants who were involved in establishing and overseeing the Robodebt scheme keep their jobs?
It's a question with a sting. First of all, I should acknowledge that some of the changes in the culture of the departments happened before my time. And we are very fortunate that we have very capable leaders in DSS with Ray Griggs and also Rebecca Skinner and her leadership team at Service Australia. So I think there is cultural change underway. And one of the key cultural changes, and the departments can speak for themselves, but one of the key cultural changes I think any organisation always needs to have is it should ask itself the question, am I hearing the bad news that I need to hear? Because invariably, if organisations at a certain level don't hear bad news, then what they will get is worse news. So I guess put in a nicer way, I'm relatively confident, I'm confident that with the current leadership in both of the areas that I'm responsible for now, Rebecca and the team at the NDIA, the leadership of those departments and agencies, and the same for Hearing Australia, which I've got, are being told what they need to know, not what they think their juniors want them to know. So I think that is changing, and certainly I hope, and that's my position, and I've visited 20 plus Services Australia Centrelink offices, great teams. I've visited the NDIA many times, a little flex here. I've visited the NDIA more times than all of the coalition ministers ever did. But I hope that they pick up that attitude. We want to hear the problems as well as the good news. In terms of what happens, we have to wait for the Royal Commission to make its findings. As a sort of amateur expert of Royal Commissions, focus on the adverse finding context and see if there's an adverse finding. Of course, an adverse finding isn't a criminal judgment, it's just an adverse finding. It's an administrative proposition in a report to a government. I think once we know if there are any adverse findings and against whom they're made and what they say, then I think we'll have to consider what to do with those people. And I'm sure the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Secretary's Committee of the Government will be working out what to do about current public servants, either in existing positions or who might have moved to other positions within the Commonwealth Public Service. I won't preempt that process. So there's 2 steps to go, Royal Commission and then how the Commonwealth Public Service leadership proposed to look at those people. I will say this, I think there's a lot of incredibly decent people in the public service and many at the senior levels, but thank goodness we had this Royal Commission. The Coalition said it was a bad idea. I was absolutely of a different view. It has exposed a soullessness and a hollowness in parts of the public service at its highest levels and the ministries, which I think has actually shocked people. And we've got to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that never happens again? Culture of bad news being reported, and also there should be consequences for the people who did the wrong thing, but I won't name names. We'll just wait and see what the processes emerge with. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. Next question, Sarah Tomevska.
Thank you for your speech, Minister. Sarah Tomevska from SBS. You've spoken about barriers to participation. You'd be aware that culturally and linguistically diverse people participate at half the rate projected by the NDIA, while the First Peoples Disability Network estimates there are 60,000 Indigenous people missing from the scheme. I spoke to a man a year ago, a Myanmar refugee. He suffered a stroke while fleeing ethnic persecution. He was 34 years old. When he got to Australia, he spent his first 2 years housebound. He didn't even know that help existed. He then spent another year housebound because once he discovered the NDIS, he had no idea how to navigate the system, and there are thousands of people like that man.
Yep.
What are you doing to help people actually access the scheme?
That's a great point, Sarah, and people can, if you still remember the answer I gave a couple of questions back when we were talking about diagnosis, I did say there are some people who are not getting into the scheme who should be in the scheme, if you remember that answer. I had called and First Nations people in mind when I was giving that. The agency's launched its First Nations strategy. We're working with a lot of organisations, First Nations people, so it's with them. It is true what you say, that if you just take an examination of First Nations people or people who come from a non-English speaking background, their average package and their average use of the package is lower than the Australian community at large. So I'm not sugarcoating, there is an issue there. The great irony, of course, is that some people complain that we're spending too much and others say that we're not getting to the right people. And sometimes both of those things can be right. We've called communities. I've been meeting with the peak bodies, FECA and the other representatives. I'm looking to the review to look at how we make sure that access to NDIS is equally shared. I think there's a few things we can do though. Again, it starts with the capability of the agency. I'd like to see more people with First Nations and call background in the agency. I also think it simplifies, if any of you have ever had to have a family member or on the NDIA can be very bureaucratic, so I'm looking at how we just simplify our front door of the scheme. I'm interested in us doing more outreach as well. It's not everyone's a digital native online. Not everyone thinks to go to a government office. So how do we do more outreach and meet with, say, for example, associations who represent Australians of a non-English speaking background? So I think outreach is part of the solution too. It's a work in progress.
Thank you. Next question from Brandon Howe.
Thanks, Minister, for your speech. Brandon Howe from innovationoz.com. You've spoken many times on the need to invest in the NDIS capabilities. I thought I might just ask on the digital capabilities that underpin it. Ahead of the election last year, around the end of April, you said that an over-reliance on technology was creating a robo-NDIS. What work have you done to mitigate that over-reliance on automated assessment systems, and do they still exist in the scheme? And I thought, as an amateur Royal Commission expert, I might ask to touch on calls for a Royal Commission into the use of automated assessment systems in the NDIS.
We're always going to use automation and crunch data. Let's not confuse taking the human element out of it with taking the machines out of it as well. There's so much data in the world of disability, not only in the NDIA, but more generally across Service Australia at state levels. We're not using data enough. We need to be able to, for example, a simple example could be patterns of behaviour in terms of people over-servicing and putting in false invoices. There's so much we could be doing. And on the positive side, in remote areas of New South Wales and Queensland, Tassie, wherever, if we know that we've got a certain postcode which has trouble getting services into those remote communities, how do we tackle thin markets? I was in Port Hedland talking to the Aboriginal Health Organisation there. They've got data, we've got data. So automation and using data is excellent, but it's the purpose it's used for, and it's the manner in which it's the ethical framework around it. That's a different issue. To me, Robodebt's not a failure of computers. It's a failure of the humans operating them, or the policymakers operating them, saying we'll just rely on that and nothing else. So if we spend more money on building the capability of the agency, we better train our crew, we increase specialisation, we build a national data asset, which I know my colleagues in Canberra and also at state level are doing. I think we can get the balance right, but there should always be an ethical framework around the use of AI. My view is it should be ideally, wherever possible, open sourced so that people can see what's going in. And the best protection of data is to co-produce with citizens. And if they can see, you can't do this in all things at all times, and don't see me tomorrow and say, why haven't we got open source and everything? But I think that there's a principle about the more that citizens feel they can control their own data, the more they'll actually trust government. But the use of data is not the problem. It's whether or not you've got the oversights, the ethical framework, and the decision-making relying just on one input. Robodebt was all about relying on one fact. It was saying that if your fortnightly income you declared to the social services was different to an average of your annual income according to the tax office, the government reversed the onus and the individual had to prove they were innocent. That was, I think, a core system design ethical failure. Thanks.
Thank you. Our broadcast is going to 1:40 today, Mr. Shorten, so just a few more minutes. Our next question, Miriam Webster.
Miriam Webber from the Canberra Times. Minister, you've spoken about increasing staffing caps at the NDIA. How many more staff can the agency have, and how will you ensure that they have the skills to provide the appropriate oversight of the scheme?
Some of this is all matters for that amazing beast called ERC, so I would never get ahead of myself. But we've got to go up. In other words, we've got to increase the number of direct public servants. And I've got a couple of reasons for saying that. Being a Commonwealth public servant is an admirable career. And I think that for 9 years, it's been, so you hear the language of just Canberra public servants, blah, blah, blah. And it's sort of been used in a derogatory approach. When I think about NDIA staff, it's the same as I think about Service Australia staff. These are individuals dealing with families trying to work out their future. So I think it's a fantastic vocation. And I think that we shouldn't rely on temporary labour all the time. Like sometimes you need temporary labour, surges in demand, of course you do. But we have a massive churn in non-NDIA jobs in the disability sectors. You know, the local area coordinators, support coordinators, partners in community. We even have a churn in the NDIA, but not as great. So I don't blame people. If you don't have a permanent job and you can't see what's happening to you 2, 3, 4 years down the track, you'll go to a job where you are appreciated, even if it mightn't be the one you vocationally want. So I think that the philosophy behind investing in our public service makes perfect sense. And we're going to do that. I mean, as for specific numbers, you know, I'll take that on notice, but I know we are there. I mentioned in my speech some of the call centre functions. They're great people working in call centres, but quite often they can't access the records because they're a contract call centre worker, not a direct employee. So it's double handling. So, and you don't actually save money by outsourcing all the time at all. That's a bit of that fiction's been, I think, exposed, that it's a very inconsistent benefit. So more staff, and as for training, there are a lot of good people working in the agency, just as work across all my agencies. But the more you invest time in them, the better outcome you get. See, one CEO or one minister can't deal with all the people that the agency deals with. But if we invest in our thousands of people in the agency, we bring in some of the people working in the disability ecosystem who already know what they're doing in terms of, and they know the area and they come and work with us too. What I want to give participants, because it all gets back to them, the purpose of having a well-trained agency with specialised skills is it gives predictability, continuity, consistency and empathy. What I really want is for people to deal with the same person twice, and then maybe even 3 times. And then maybe they don't feel like they've got to explain their story again and again and again, which is fatiguing. I mean, you know, I went to the brute face of capitalism the other day, the Apple shop, and that was fatiguing. And I just had a moment of what it must be like to be on the phones at Services Australia. Anyway, I digress. Your point's very good, and I think the more we invest in our public service, the more we train them up. And by the way, the sort of people I want to come into the agency, people with disability, not just at entry-level positions. I want people who maybe carers personally in their own lives and realise they're quite good at it and have a vocation for it. I'd love to encourage kids at secondary school level to learn more about disability. We've got to make it clear that disability is not just cleaning people. It's not just bodily functions of people and looking after them. It is about changing people's lives. So I want to, not just the NDIA, I'd like the NDIA to be an agency of choice in the public service, and I'd like disability to be a career of choice for young people, for people returning to work after a period of separation from work, for people with disability, and of course for carers who might, through their family experience, be geniuses at actually disability work generally.
Thank you. Next question, Melissa Code.
Hi, Minister. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. My question is also about uplifting agency capability, but specifically the public servants with IT skills. So you mentioned at various points in your speech how data was an important part of the how, the systemic change that you wanted to see materialise. The APSC have decided not to make people with IT skills a specialist classification, and obviously the cost of contracting and outsourcing that work is quite expensive, so it has implications for spend. What are your views on that challenge?
It's a good point. I'm going to have to follow up on that. I wish people with IT had a union, because then the union might have raised that point. Yeah, I think it is an important specialisation. So I don't know all the backstory to the point you've raised, but I'll certainly acquaint myself with it. One thing we are doing, of course, is supporting employment services. We've got to redefine our notion of people with disability and their ability to work. Employing people with disability is not contagious. It's not actually difficult. And I think that one area which I've seen some really good work in is people with an autism diagnosis who then have really good specialisation skills in such areas as you've mentioned, and there's quite a bit of success around. So, you know, this is what's exciting about being in government, and this is what's exciting about rebooting the NDIS. We are limited by our imaginations alone about what we can accomplish, and if we dispense with the tyranny of low expectations, then this scheme can be really something very special. And it just includes people with disability into our society generally, and that we're all going to be better off for that outcome.
Next question, Adrian Armitage.
Minister, Adrian Armitage, freelance journalist at the Press Club, but also CEO of the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses. So I'm speaking today on behalf of the 24,000 nurses out there in the mental health space. You spoke earlier about warriors that we have in the space, and I couldn't be more humbled than be representing some of the best performing people in the world, I think, personally. And you spoke about the challenges of a house that didn't have doors that open. So the question today is, for the last decade, our mental health nurses and the credentialed mental health nurses have been hitting their head against this door. And where do you see mental health nurses being part of the credentialed ones being part of the solution going forward?
Listen, I'm not an expert in your area, but I agree with you about your acknowledgement of mental health nurses and their value they create and the people they help. Just some rough numbers. People whose primary or condition is psychosocial on the NDIS is about north of 60,000 people on the scheme. There is a bit of a desert though. What happened is a lot of community mental health programs were rolled into the NDIS as part of states and feds sort of bulking up the funding, but they weren't replaced. So there's people who need more than a couple of sessions of therapy but are not sufficiently impaired that they require the NDIS. So mental health nurses have taken some of that burden, I suspect, I believe. I am working with the unions in the disability sector. They've got some really good points about how do we make sure they get access to training in a sort of in a gig economy and a casualised workforce. How do they get access to better rates of pay and proper qualification? One of the challenges in the sector is that not every provider is registered in the NDIS, and if we tried to register everyone, we'd lose a too big a portion of our workforce. But I do think that when it comes to the accreditation of people doing personal care, there have to be minimum standards. That also helps nurses because their qualifications then get treated with the importance it deserves. Within the NDIS, we were able to move people's wages along upon coming to government through the last increases in the scheme, price increases in the scheme. But I think part of the challenge for mental health nurses is the mental health system, and that's another talk. I can contribute partly to it, and I welcome hearing your views on it on an ongoing basis. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Minister, are you just fine with the last couple of questions? Or have you...
Sure.
Cool. Next question, Amy Ramikis.
Hi, Amy Ramikis from The Guardian. Bit of an overview with this one, and I know, do not tell me we'll wait for the budget. We know what the government is going to spend money on. We know AUKUS is happening. We know stage 3 tax cuts are still in. But why is it the vulnerable who always seem to have to wait for answers? HECS-DEX is indexed at a rate that is causing massive financial and emotional pain for young people. Your 6-step plan to reform the NDIS is going to take time. We've had no word on whether welfare will become livable. So why do the vulnerable have to wait even under your government?
Well, thanks for that policy contribution, Amy. I don't buy what you're saying, but I get some of it. I don't think it's a simple binary between a particular defence infrastructure project or something else. In my area that I'm responsible for, the vulnerable haven't had to wait. I've got rid of third-party debt collectors last week. I think that was an inappropriate administrative tool. If a government and an individual have got a disagreement about a debt, it's on us to sort it out with the individual. We don't have to go to third-party debt collectors. So that's an example of how we're changing things for the vulnerable, which I'm sure you'd agree with. In the NDIS, I want to be very clear. The scheme is going to go up. We're going to spend more next year than we did this year, and we'll spend more the year after, and so on. So I don't want to scare people with disability. You're making a political point about other things, which is fair enough, about the dole and that, and that's fair enough. But I don't want that concern to leach into what we're doing in the NDIS. The NDIS isn't paying for subs, as Peter Dutton suggested we should, and it isn't responsible for other areas of government welfare programs. You use the word welfare about the NDIS. I don't use the word welfare about the NDIS. The NDIS is based upon a universal assumption. It's not means tested. It's based on the assumption that if you have a permanent and significant severe disability, that you can get an individualised package of support which lets you to lead a more fulfilling life. This is not welfare. It's support, absolutely, but it's based on the, and there's nothing wrong with welfare, but this is not a welfare program. To me, I put this in with Medicare. It's part of the safety net of Australia, which says that we want all Australians to share equally in the opportunities of this country. So what we're doing at NDIS, have the arguments about raise the rate, fine, I get that, I can see that point of view. Have the arguments about a general sense that we shouldn't, you think, or not you, but some people say we shouldn't be spending money on submarines. That's someone else's point of view. But on the NDIS, this is straight down the line. I'm interested in how I make the NDIS as strong and as sustainable as it can be, providing the best opportunities for people. And at no point have I come under any pressure from the Treasurer or anyone else to say that somehow we've got to slash and burn the NDIS to subsidise something else, because that's not the way this government thinks. But thanks very much, Amy.
Just the final question from me, Mr. Shorten, and a political one. You made your, at the end of your speech, you made pretty heartfelt comments about your commitment to the portfolio. But there's been obviously speculation about, your name gets mentioned for maybe a diplomatic posting in the future. and as a student of Napoleon, sir, do you still have the Marshal's baton in the knapsack?
Well, as a student of mixed metaphors, you should get a PhD.
My retreat from Moscow, perhaps.
No, my point is this. It was disappointing not to win 2019, absolutely. But it's an understanding I reached after that. The universe doesn't grant reruns, so I think that deals with your Napoleonic analogies. But it is unusual in the cycle of politics to somehow have had the opportunity to be involved at the very start of this scheme and to get the chance to come back in an even more senior position to work with fabulous people to get it on the right track. And that's quite remarkable. So, on this note, the universe never ceases to surprise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill Shorten, for your time.